Morning, church. Morning. Hey, if we have not had a chance to meet yet, my name is Doug. I am one of the pastors here at Venture Missionary Church. And this morning, we're going to continue a series. We're actually kind of coming almost to the end of a series that we've been in for several weeks, actually going all the way back to the beginning of June, called One-Liners. And during this series, we've been looking at a variety of different Bible verses, really common Bible verses, verses that have become so familiar and so common that they often get misquoted, misunderstood, and sort of misapplied. And since we believe that when it comes to God's word, accuracy matters, we've been trying to correct some of those misunderstandings throughout this series. And so this morning, we're going to be looking at a phrase from John chapter 8. It's a phrase that most of us have heard from. It's a phrase that goes like this: the truth shall set you free. We've all heard that, right? We've heard it all over the place. This is another one of those familiar phrases that, while it has its origins in the Bible, it also pops up all over the place. It pops up in literature, in song lyrics, in internet memes, in political speeches, and especially in TV shows and movies. And so because of that, most people don't even know where it comes from. Some people may have maybe a general idea that maybe it comes from somewhere in the Bible, but most people don't know, number one, that it even is in the Bible, and two, where in the Bible and what it actually means. In fact, let me just give you or show you a few examples. Check this out.
And the truth shall set you free.
Ted, the truth will set you free.
The truth will set you free.
The truth will set you free, brother.
The truth will set you free.
The truth will set you free, baby.
The truth will set you free.
You will know the truth, and this truth will set you free.
Only the truth will set you free.
Now they want the truth. You know, the truth shall set you free.
The truth will set you free. The truth and the truth alone shall set you free.
Okay, so this phrase is everywhere, but most people don't really understand what it means. So when I was a freshman in high school, I joined the water polo team, and I fell in love with the sport of water polo. And it began to sort of consume my time, consume my attention, consume my energy. It's sort of like the only reason I went to school was just so that I could play water polo. And I got to the point that it began affecting my grades. So I ended up, I was midway through the first quarter, I was failing my science class. Freshman year, midway through the first quarter, I'm already failing a class. Not a great sign. But again, I was like so passionate about this sport that I loved and hanging out with all my friends, and I just was not doing very well in school, particularly in this one class. Well, the mid-quarter grades got sent home. My mom found out that I had an F in one of my classes, and she said, that's it. Like, I can't have you playing sports until you get your grade up. So you're not going to be able to continue playing water polo until you get this grade up. Now, the problem was for me, we had a really important game coming up the next Friday. It was against our crosstown rivals, and so I was like, no, I have to play. In fact, I had told some of my friends on the team, hey, I might not be able to play, grades, whatever. And they're like, you better get that grade up. You need to play. It was sort of like, you need to fix this problem. And so I'm thinking to myself, how do I fix this problem? How do I solve this problem? Now, again, I should have just gotten the grade up, but I didn't want to do that. That was going to take work. And so I was trying to think of some other way of solving the problem. And so the morning of this water polo game, this crosstown rival game on a Friday, I still hadn't solved the problem. I hadn't made up my work. I hadn't made up the test. I hadn't gone and talked to the teacher. I hadn't done any of the things I should have done. I was looking for the easy way out. And the easy way out came in the form of my friend, Mike Ortega. I was in first period Spanish class. He heard about my plight. He was a big grown-up sophomore, so he said, Doug, why don't you just forge a note? I said, forge a note? I have terrible handwriting. My mom will know that it's me. He said, I've got great handwriting. Just tell me what you want it to say, and I'll forge the note for you. So I told him what to say. Dear Mrs. Colby, Doug has been performing wonderfully in my class, has made up all of his work, has brought his grade up to a C. I didn't want to say an A. She would see through that. So I thought, okay, just a C, just passing. So I dictated this whole note, and he wrote it with this like beautiful handwriting. I'm like, oh my gosh, you really do write like a teacher. He's all, I know. So he writes out this note, and then I fold it up, and then at lunchtime, I called my mom to let her know that I had a note from my teacher that my grade was up and that I was planning on playing that day in the game. Now, I was hoping that it would just end there. She said, okay, well, I will be there before the game, and I'd like to see the note. Okay, here's the test. So, water polo warm-ups before the game. I'm in the water, I'm warming up. I see my mom walk onto the deck. I swim over to the edge. I come to the edge and said, Mom, the note is in my backpack. It's right up there in the stands. And so I'm watching her kind of corner my eye as I swim away. Oh, dear God. I think I really was praying, which is a terrible thing to pray. God, please let me get away with this big fat lie, right? So she walks over and I watch her dig through my backpack. I watch her pull out the note. She reads it. She folds it up. She puts it back in. She comes to the edge of the pool deck. I'll never forget this. My poor mom, she's sitting over there right now. She's probably reliving this moment. I swim over to the pool deck to the edge and she looks at me in the eyes and she says, and kids, when your mom or dad or a parent or grandparent, when they ask this question, she said, Doug, did your teacher really write that note? There was a moment for me. There was a crossroads. That was the moment that I could have said, no, but I really wanted to play, right? I could have been honest. I could have told the truth, but I dug my heels in. I said, oh no, Mom, yeah, she really wrote the note. Yeah, right? And I'm looking her dead in the eye and I'm telling this bald-faced lie to my mother so that I could play in this one game. And she looked at me one more time. She said, are you sure? Yeah. Okay. And so she walks back to the stands and sits down. So we play in this game. We lose the game. Wasn't even worth it. I get home, and if I remember correctly, it wasn't just my mom. I think it was my mom and my dad sitting there. And I walk in, and I'm like, hey, what's happening? And so I sit down, and my mom asks me again, Doug, please just tell me the truth. Did your teacher really write that note? I look them dead in the face and I say, yes, she really did write the note. And my mom says this, she says, then why did she misspell her own name? Mike Ortega, you had one job, bro, one job. Beautiful handwriting and you literally spelled the name Mrs. Murray with one R. Are you kidding me right now? Totally blew it. She saw right through it. I ended up having to step off the team for the rest of the season. It was terrible. But that experience, and some of you have similar kinds of experiences, big lies that sort of blew up and you swore, I'm never gonna tell another lie. That experience taught me a very important lesson about the importance of telling the truth. And so for most of us, when we hear that phrase, the truth will set you free, that's the sort of thing we think of. We think of the importance of telling the truth. We think of the idea that when we tell the truth, it sort of sets us free from, the burden and the guilt that comes when you're telling a lie or when you're hiding the truth or when you're keeping secrets. And then on top of that, because we live in a world of fake news and conspiracy theories and deep fake videos and AI-generated images, it definitely seems to most of us like the truth is becoming harder and harder to find. But this morning, as we look more closely at this phrase in its original context, we're going to ask ourselves this question. Is that really what this phrase is about? Is just telling the truth? Is this just a reminder from Jesus to, hey, remember kids, tell the truth? Is that really all that's going on here? Is just a reminder to tell the truth? And that when we do tell the truth, it sets us free from the burden that we feel when we've told a lie? Now, I'm sure that all of us would agree that telling the truth is a good thing, that being honest is a good thing. But we're going to discover this morning that when Jesus first spoke those words in John chapter 8, he wasn't just talking about the importance of the truth in general. He was talking about a very specific truth that has the power to completely transform our lives. So if you have your Bibles or Bible app this morning, I'm going to invite you to turn to John chapter 8. John chapter 8. If you don't have a Bible with you this morning, it's going to be on the screen behind me, so you'll be able to follow along. But we're going to be in John chapter 8. So let me read this to you. We're going to read from John chapter 8. This is verses 31 and 32. Now, in a moment, we're going to zoom out and we're going to read a bit more than that, but we're going to start with just this little section in John chapter 8, verses 31 and 32. So let me read it out loud and you can follow along. It says this, "To the Jews who had believed him, Jesus said," now this is Jesus speaking, he said, "If you hold to my teaching, you really are my disciples. Then you will know the truth," and here it is, "the truth will set you free." So there it is. There's our phrase, right? So what I want to do this morning is I want to take a couple of minutes to look a little bit more closely at these two verses to make sure that we understand what's being said here, and then we're going to zoom out. And when we zoom out, the reason that we're going to zoom out, we're going to read some of what happens before this takes place, before Jesus said these words, and then we're going to read some of what happens immediately after Jesus said these words. And together, as we sort of zoom out and understand these words in context, it's going to help us figure out what Jesus is actually talking about here. So the first thing that I want to point out in this little section here is who Jesus is talking to. So in verse 31, we find out that Jesus was talking to a group of Jewish men and probably women because of where he was in the temple courts in the city of Jerusalem who were listening to him teach and who had begun to believe what he was saying. That word believe in the Greek doesn't just mean to sort of believe a fact. It means to put your trust in something or to put faith in something or someone. So these were Jewish men and women who were beginning to believe what Jesus was saying, were beginning to trust what he was saying, were beginning to put their faith in what Jesus was saying. But as we're going to see in a moment, when we zoom out, Jesus wasn't just speaking to those who believed in him. He was in this particular sort of set of verses, but the broader conversation that he was having was actually with a group of hostile religious leaders who were criticizing Jesus, arguing with Jesus, trying to trap Jesus, and eventually even trying to arrest and kill Jesus. And we'll see why this is important in just a moment. The second thing that I want to point out about this particular little section, these two verses, is the word that Jesus uses to talk about holding to his teachings. If you look, he says, "If you hold to my teachings." That phrase "hold to" is actually a translation of the Greek word meno, and meno means to abide or to remain or to continue. It's the same word that Jesus uses in John chapter 15, verse 5, when he says, "If you remain in me and my words remain in you," right? If you remember that, some of you will remember those famous words from Jesus. It's the exact same word. It means to abide. It means to remain. It means to continue or to endure in something. So here in verse 31, that means that Jesus isn't just talking about hearing his teachings. He was talking about those who believed in his teachings, those who were trusting in his teaching, those who were relying on his teachings, those who were allowing his teachings to begin to shape their lives. But as we're going to see in just a few minutes, he wasn't just talking about his teachings in general. Jesus taught a lot of things. He wasn't just talking about his teaching in general. He was talking about a very specific teaching here that had to do with a very specific topic. More on that in just a moment. The third thing that I want to point out about these two verses is Jesus' emphasis on truth in these two verses, or in this larger passage. As we're going to see when we zoom out, Jesus uses the Greek word, or the word, and it's a Greek word, aletheia, 7 different times in just a few short verses, including twice here in verse 32. You see that highlighted on the screen. So it's clear that Jesus is talking about the truth here in this passage. The question is, what truth? Truth in general? Truth about anything? What truth? And more to the point, what exactly does that truth, whatever truth Jesus is talking about, what exactly does that truth set us free from? Those are the questions that we're attempting to answer as we continue. To answer those questions, we're going to have to zoom out a bit. We're going to have to zoom out and look at what happens immediately before these two verses that we just read and what happens immediately after these two verses. So we're going to go all the way back to chapter 7, okay? Because we're zooming out. We narrowed in on 2 verses. Now we're zooming out and we're looking back at John chapter 7. And in John chapter 7, we discovered, I'm going to kind of narrate some of it for you, although we'll read bits and pieces. But when we go back to John chapter 7, this is all kind of part of the same section, the same sequence of events. When we go back to John chapter 7, we discover that Jesus had secretly entered the city of Jerusalem during one of the 3 major annual Jewish festivals called the Feast of Tabernacles. And the Feast of Tabernacles was a week-long festival that culminated with a huge celebration with lights and music and dancing at the temple. And according to John chapter 7, there was this debate that was sort of going on throughout the city during the celebration, during this festival, about the identity and the qualifications of Jesus. In fact, in verse 12, we read this, that among the crowds, there was widespread whispering about Jesus. There was this kind of like rumors that were going on about Jesus. Some said, he's a good man. Others replied, no, he deceives the people. So there's kind of 2 sides. Some people are like, no, he's a good guy. I've heard him. I met him, shook his hand, good guy. Others are like, no, I think he's a liar. I think he's deceiving the people. So there's this argument and debate sort of going on throughout the city of Jerusalem during this feast festival of the tabernacle. Then in verse 13, after Jesus had shown up in the temple and begun to teach the people who were gathered there, we read this, that the Jews there were amazed. And they asked, how did this man get such learning without having been taught? In other words, we've all been brought up in these rabbinical schools, and here's this guy, and who gave him this authority? How is he teaching what he is teaching? Who imparted authority to him to be able to come into our temple and begin to teach in the temple in Jerusalem? And so there was this conflict that began between Jesus and the people, and Jesus and the religious leaders. And in verse 20, some of them went so far as to begin to accuse Jesus of being demon-possessed. Imagine that. Like they're literally accusing Jesus of being demon-possessed. That's how hostile this group was. And then after several more verses of arguing back and forth with Jesus, the people were still confused about who Jesus was. And so when we look at verse 40 and we pick it back up again, we read this. Some of them said, surely this man is the prophet. Others said, no, he's the Messiah. Still others asked, well, wait a minute. How can the Messiah come from Galilee? Doesn't Scripture say that the Messiah is going to come from David's descendants and from Bethlehem, the town where David lived? So the people were divided because of Jesus. There was confusion about who Jesus was. Some wanted to seize him and arrest him, but no one laid a hand on him. So as chapter 7 closes, and again, you can go and read all of chapter 7 yourself, and I encourage you to do so today, but as chapter 7 closes, with these questions about Jesus' identity and his qualifications sort of still swirling through the city of Jerusalem. People are still not sure, and they're still asking, they're still debating, and they're still discussing, who is he? Where does he come from? Who gave him this authority? Is he demon-possessed? No, he's a good guy. No, he's a Messiah. No, he's a prophet. All of this debate going on. Verse 53 at the end of chapter 7 tells us that everyone went home for the night. So the dust sort of settles, everyone goes home for the night. And then it says that Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Now, that was a place that Jesus often went to go and pray. So chapter 7 closes, and chapter 8 begins the next morning. The next morning, as chapter 8 begins, we find Jesus back at the temple again. And this is where the story really starts to heat up. This is where this hostility between Jesus and the religious leaders really comes to a head, as you're going to see in just a moment. Because this is the moment when that same group of Jewish leaders who had been arguing with Jesus the day before, confronting Jesus the day before, criticizing Jesus the day before, decided to take things up a notch. In John chapter 8, they ambushed Jesus while he was still teaching in the temple courts that morning, and they came in dragging behind them a woman that they had caught in the act of adultery. We read what happens beginning in chapter 8, verse 2. It says, at dawn, Jesus appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees, these are the religious leaders, brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group, and they said to Jesus, teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. The law of Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say? The narrator says, John says, that they were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept questioning him, he straightened up and he said to them, okay, let any one of you who is without sin throw the first stone at her. And again, he stooped down and continued writing on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away, one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left, with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." I love this story. Such a beautiful example of the grace and the mercy that Jesus demonstrates towards people like this woman and people like me and people like us who don't deserve it. But let's not forget why we're here in John chapter 8 in the first time. Powerful little section that we just read, and I don't want to just skip over that, but let's not forget why we're in John chapter 8 in the first place. Remember that we're zooming out to see what comes immediately before Jesus' famous statement that the truth shall set us free. And we're zooming out so that we can read what happens immediately after, so that we can understand what Jesus meant with those words. That's why we're looking through John chapter 7 and John chapter 8, to understand what led up to that moment when Jesus said those words. And what he meant is going to start becoming really clear over the next couple of minutes. So back to John chapter 8. So after the woman who had been caught in the act of adultery had left, after the dust had sort of settled and the scene had sort of ended, Jesus turned to the people who were still gathered and he continued to teach them in the temple courts. But the religious leaders, they weren't done yet. They were probably still fuming from being humiliated by Jesus in that whole scene with this woman. So they began to challenge him again. And then finally in verse 25, they just come right out and they just ask him straight up what they've been curious about the whole time. They just ask him, "Who are you?" They've been asking, "Who gave you credentials?" They've been asking, "Where are you from?" Now they just come straight out and they just ask him, "Who are you?" And listen to how Jesus responds to their question. "Who am I?" "Just what I have been telling you from the beginning." This is verse 25. Jesus replied, "I have much to say in judgment of you," Jesus says to these religious leaders. He says, "But he who sent me is trustworthy, and what I have heard from him, I am telling the world." They didn't understand that he was telling them about his Father. So Jesus said, "When you have lifted up the Son of Man," the Son of Man is a common phrase that Jesus often used to describe himself, "then," he says, "you will know that I am he, and that I do nothing on my own, but I speak just what the Father has taught me. The one who sent me is with me. He has not left me alone, for I always do what pleases him." And even as he spoke, many believed in him. Many put their trust in him. Many put their faith in him. Now, what Jesus just said there at first glance may seem a bit cryptic. If we read it in the context of what he's been saying all the way up to this point and what he says after, it becomes crystal clear. Now remember that what we're trying to do this morning is we're looking back to see what happened right before Jesus made his famous statement in verse 32 that the truth shall set us free. Because we want to try to understand what the truth is that Jesus is talking about. And from the time that Jesus appeared in the temple courts all the way back in chapter 7, all the way through what we just read from chapter 8, all the way through the rest of chapter 8, Jesus has been consistently responding to their challenges, their criticism, their questions, and their confusion with one central claim: that he is the Son of God. That's what Jesus has been saying. Now, some of the ways that he phrases it to our modern ears feels a bit cryptic, but if you go back and read what he says, it is abundantly clear. Jesus is making the claim that he is the Son of God. In other words, he's not just a rabbi. He wasn't just a teacher. He wasn't just a wise philosopher with some good ideas about maybe how we might want to live if we so choose. He is the Son of God who has been sent by the Father. And some of the people who who were listening to him explain who he was, some of them got it, and some of them believed. Some of them put their trust in him. Some of them began to rely on him and put their faith in him, and some of them didn't. In fact, you notice what it said in verse 30. It says that some believed him. Some of the people listening believed him. And remember, that word belief is more than just, I think I believe that. It's to put trust in, to put faith in. So some of the people listening said, I believe what he's saying. I'm putting my trust and my faith in that. And if you remember what Jesus said, this is what he said to those who believed. And it brings us back to the verses that we started with. He said, if you abide in my teachings, if you hold to my teachings, if you endure in my teachings, if you build your life around my teaching, then you really are my disciple. And if you really are my disciple, then you will know the truth. Which brings us back to the question we started with. What truth? What truth do we know that has this power? The truth that Jesus has been talking about for 2 straight chapters. The truth about who he was and who he is. The essential truth at the center of the Christian faith, which is this, the truth that Jesus is the incarnate God made flesh who entered into his own creation as both fully God and fully human in order to do for humanity what we could never do for ourselves. This is the central claim of Jesus' life and ministry. Not just some good ideas about how we might want to live if we so choose, but this reality that Jesus is the incarnate God made flesh who has entered into the world to do for us what we could never do for ourselves. Friends, this is the whole point of what Jesus' ministry hinges on. It's the whole point of everything we've read this morning. It's that Jesus himself is the truth, which is exactly what he says a few chapters later in John chapter 14, verse 6, when he says, I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life. Jesus makes this claim repeatedly throughout his ministry. And this truth that Jesus was referring to in verse 32, when he made that famous statement about the truth setting us free, wasn't just about any old truth. It wasn't just about the importance of telling the truth. It wasn't even about the value of acknowledging the existence of objective absolute truth. The truth that Jesus was talking about, the truth that Jesus was referring to, the truth that Jesus had been presenting was himself, that he is the truth, that he is God himself, and he's the only one who has the power to set us free, which should cause us to ask the question, free from what? I'm so glad you asked. Let's finish reading and find out. Because no sooner does Jesus get through saying, you'll know the truth. If you follow my teachings, you're my disciple, and you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Jesus continues with these words in verse 34. Jesus replied, very truly, I tell you, everyone who sins is basically a slave to sin. Now, a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son, a child, belongs to it forever. So if the Son, he's talking about himself, sets you free, you will be free indeed. So now that we've zoomed out, we can finally go back and answer those 2 questions that we started with. When Jesus said the words, the truth will set you free, what truth was he talking about? And what exactly does that truth set us free from? Well, when we zoom out and we read these verses in context, it becomes abundantly clear that the truth that he was referring to was himself and his own self-identity as the incarnate Son of God. And the thing that he has the power to set us free from is from sin. He has the ability to set us free from the power of sin, from the control of sin, from the influence of sin, and from the consequences of sin, which means that if you and I, church, hear me when I say this, if you and I have repented from sin and placed your trust in Jesus, that means that he has set you you free from your past, and he has set you free from uncertainty about your future. He has set you free from the endless dialogue in your head, free from the voice that keeps putting you down, free from worrying about what everyone else thinks, what everyone else says, what everyone else does, free from having to look a certain way, act a certain way, be a certain way, free from constantly worrying about everyone else's opinions, free from pride, free from greed, free from lust, free from anger, free from addiction, free from our unhinged, out of control emotions, free from all the distractions, confusion, and noise, free from wanting more money, more pleasure, more stuff, free from your mistakes, free from guilt, free from your screw-ups, free from your insecurities, free from your inadequacies, free from your insufficiencies, free from your own harsh, critical negativity, free from feeling discouraged, from being depressed, lonely, free from not feeling good enough or loved enough, free from all the fear. And if that wasn't enough, Jesus has set us free from sin, from the power of sin, from the guilt of sin, from the influence of sin, and from the eternal consequences of sin. And so, friends, even on the days when it feels still like sin has grip on our life, even on those days, we can be confident that if Jesus Christ, the Son of God, has set us free, then you and I are free indeed. Amen? Amen. And that's why we gather, and that's why we come together to remind ourselves of this eternal reality that we have staked our lives on. And so, friends, if you're able, would you stand to your feet, and let's finish by praising this great and powerful name of Jesus. Josh, would you lead us?